they couldn't do anything about it, and they just sort of put it out of their mind and carried on with life. And then here you got these two guys showing up at the door, hey, you got to stop talking about, you can't talk about what happened. Hey, we weren't talking about, what happened. So them showing up sort of like, it just made it so that they were forced to re-examine the event again. And, it just sort of like, I guess by them telling them to shut up about it, it just made it so that they wanted to look into it deeper. It was January 20th, 1967. Mrs. Walter J. Kushner was behind the wheel of her car. Also in the car were her two daughters, Susan, 17, and Tanya, 14, and another girl who was close with the family, Marion Williamson, 16. They were returning to the Kushner home after an evening out. It was 11:30 p.m. None of the girls were tired, and they had planned on having a pajama party and staying up to the wee hours of the morning. As the girls chatted, their attention was suddenly drawn to something in the sky. A brilliant pink form with a distinct disc shape dropped below the clouds and executed a sharp turn before cruising above and parallel to a mountain ridge. Everyone in the car observed it, and they took notice of not only the speed of the object, but the fact that it made no sound. Little did they realize that their evening of weirdness was only getting started. I know when I read the name, I thought, is it possible that this Marion Williamson is, the Marion Williamson that ran for president? And no, it's not. Marion Williamson would have been around 14. Well, this Marion is 16, and this happened in Pennsylvania. And as far as I know, Marion Williamson grew up in Texas. So, no, it's not her. January 21st, 1967. It was now 2 a.m. 2 hours had passed since the girls had gotten home. All were dressed in their PJs, sitting up, listening to music and laughing. Their evening of fun was suddenly interrupted by something out the window. All three girls simultaneously spotted a peculiar light shimmering through the closed curtains of Susan's bedroom. Without warning, the drapes parted of their own volition, and a small triangular object hovering a few feet from the house began beaming pinkish light of a painfully brilliant intensity into the room. When the triangle moved to the second window, the curtains again seemed to open on their own, and the intensity of the light emanating from the object increased noticeably. At this point, the girls became frightened and decided to, quote, get the hell out of there. Sadly, the object had other plans. As the girls got up to run out of the room, they suddenly found themselves completely paralyzed. Further, their bodies felt weak. They wanted to cry out for help, but they couldn't. They could only whimper helplessly and watch. They were struck with pure terror. What would happen next? None of them knew. The terror became so intense that they collectively began to pray. After a few more torturous moments, the light effect vanished, and the girls found that they could move again. And they did, straight to Mrs. Kushner's room. She was fast asleep and had not noticed anything unusual. Through tears, the three frightened girls relayed what happened to them. They worried that it might return. They were powerless to stop it if it did. Mrs. Kushner understood immediately that this was no prank. The girls were deadly serious. Something had definitely frightened them, but what? She had seen the object earlier. Could it be possible that it actually followed them home? She eventually got them settled down. They huddled together in the living room. All the lights in the house were on. When the object failed to return, Mrs. Kushner reasoned with the girls that it was best that they not talk about what happened. It simply sounded too crazy to be believed, and she feared that the girls might become a laughingstock in the community. Ultimately, all of them agreed to only speak of the incident amongst themselves. It was their secret, and nobody else needed to know. A week passed, and the girls began to settle into the idea that they had an extremely weird experience. There wasn't much they could do about it, though, so they just accepted it. Things were getting back to normal. Until that night. It was January 28th, just after dinner. 2 men arrived at the Kushner home. Mrs. Kushner was surprised to see the 2 men standing at the door. They identified themselves as investigators with the U.S. government. They handed her an impressive-looking, well, to her anyway, United States Air Force identification card. She had no way of knowing that the card, which had a heavy black print on a durable white stock, was a forgery. She also had no way of knowing that government ID cards were always laminated and included a photograph of the individual represented, and more often than not they were 2-color printed. USAF Office of Special Investigation personnel carry their identification in a special billfold. Looking them over, Mrs. Kushner noted that both individuals wore tan trench coats, which they kept buttoned from knee to collar. The taller of the 2, who, according to the family's testimony, did all the talking, was described as having blonde hair and green eyes. He was quite thin and had deeply tanned skin. The other man was shorter in stature and heavy-set with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He was also deeply tanned. Speaking to UFO investigator Robert A. Goerrman, Mrs. Kushner noted that although both men were, for the most part, very polite, they were extremely insistent about one thing. They wanted to know about the girl's experience. Every last detail. She invited them inside and was taken by the fact that they seemed to already know the layout of the rooms in detail, as if they had already been inside the house before. Goerrman himself expected the layout to be such that the rooms would be self-evident, but upon arriving at the Kushner home, he didn't know where anything was. When asked how the Air Force had learned of the UFO sighting, the taller one responded to Tanya's question with a cold, "We know a lot of things. A lot of things." Feeling slightly uneasy about the situation, the girls felt it would be in their best interest to cooperate. Although compelled to accept the situation for what it was, something seemed off-center with these 2, something they just couldn't put their finger on. Susan particularly took notice of the men's clothes. They looked as if they had purchased them in a clothing store 10 minutes before arriving at the house. Everything appeared brand new. Even their shoes looked as though they had never walked in them prior to that evening. The cigarette pack held by the taller man was unopened, and even his wallet looked new, never opened, almost like a prop. Next, the taller man pulled out a loose-leaf notebook with professionally printed schematic diagrams and photos of both interior and exterior views of various types of UFO craft. She could see the shorter officer writing something in an elongated notebook, not unlike those used by stenographers. Catching him off guard, she was amazed to see him writing strange symbols in vertical columns, starting from the left, going down 1 column, up the second, down the third, up the fourth, etc. Being accustomed to shorthand, Susan had no idea to the graphic's origin. All she knew is that whatever he was writing, it certainly wasn't English. The taller one continued talking, telling Mrs. Kushner and her daughters that UFOs were nothing more than secret U.S. experimental aircraft, and that they'd never harmed anyone. Before wrapping up, the individual told them that any public disclosure of seeing one up close could result in federal prosecution. Essentially, he was telling them if they told anyone about their UFO sighting, they could end up in jail, which is ridiculous. The whole thing was very confusing for the girls. When the 2 men got up to leave, Tanya asked how they could get in touch with them. The tall one parried the query with a stunning, "I can find you anywhere, anytime." As they stepped out the door and got in their car, the girls were further baffled when they watched them back out onto the roadway, turn off their headlights, and power on down the road. They noted that it was well after dark, and it was against Pennsylvania Commonwealth traffic laws to drive 1/2 hour after sunset without suitable lighting. Professional men such as these would know better. Heck, a 16-year-old with a day-old license wouldn't drive after dark without their lights on. What was going on, they wondered. Goerrman looked into it and determined that these 2 men had absolutely no connection with any government agency. I stumbled onto this bizarre case strictly by accident. It is important to note here that I had to work diligently to gain their confidence. and they impressed me as being a no-nonsense, sincere, and closely knit family unit. During the course of the initial investigation, it was readily apparent that the witnesses were not only totally unaware of certain basic UFO lore, but were fully ignorant of the MIB situation altogether. They kept referring to these visitors as, quote, government men, and were, to say the least, quite perplexed over the agents' illogical behavior. Remember, these events occurred in January of 1967, long before Watergate and the subsequent public release of evidence regarding apparent abuses by federal and military intelligence groups. In 1967, when a government agent told you to do something, you listened. And if this is the same agent that told you to shut up, you didn't argue. Any other course of action was, at that point in time, simply unheard of. It was all there. The dark-complected mystery men, who appeared as if from nowhere, overwhelmed the witnesses with impressive identification, then proceeded to confuse and confound even the most logical of persons. These characters all looked alike, and the patterns displayed by their MO were readily visible to all who had taken the time to carefully and seriously inspect those reports. Consistency was the name of the game, even to the just-purchased clothing, unwalked-in shoes, and spanking new wallet. The Kushner case fit the pattern perfectly. Men in Black reports began increasing in number during the summer of '66, and increased to fevered tempo up until the fall of 1968. But it wasn't until the fall of 1968 that even a handful of researchers was able to accumulate and document enough of these cases to even catch a glimmer of these patterns so obvious to us today. So what are we to believe? Are we to believe that the Kushners had the foresight to create a hoax, so precise that it would parallel other reports of MIB encounters, gathered by eager investigators 18 months later? Again, I say nonsense. These individuals honestly and without embellishment related to me the events that had transpired. These families didn't rush to send in their reports to their local UFO letterzine. If anything, the MIB encounter threw their initial sighting into such a bizarre light that they told no one at all. They were silenced. And what a beautiful way it was accomplished. If what little we know, and half of what we suspect is close to the truth, we are up against one hell of a complex and fantastic phenomenon.
Every researcher has a moment where they kind of question, is this real? Am I just collecting stories? Is this a real phenomenon? And then, typically they have a eureka case, and they just sort of, it's sort of like rings a bell, and it's like, okay, yeah, this is definitely real. This is definitely worth my time. And in this case, Goerrman had, he's an OG. Robert Goerrman is an OG investigator. He's been around for years and years. He still posts on Facebook. He's still active. He's more of a debunker now. He spends a lot of his time tearing down Keel and stuff, but he is still in the game. He's still out there. He's still working. And in this case, this was an interesting case for him because he had collected this report involving these, strange men that had come to this family's home. And this was kind of before the whole MIB craze. So he collected some notes and he thought, oh, that's really weird. But then it wasn't until later when all these investigators started pooling their notes and were like, wait, there's a pattern here. They behave a certain way, they drive a certain type of car, they act a certain way, they look a certain way, and slowly it all kind of came together. And then nowadays we just take it for granted that, they dress in black suits, or they look similar, or they drive a black car, typically an older model. They behave strangely. They, identify themselves as with the government or whatever, and they're not. So he was like, this was a eureka moment. It's like, wait a second. I collected this case years ago, and it turns out that a lot of other people have collected similar type cases. And what are the chances that they were making it up? How is it that what they said happened is exactly what somebody in some other, state said happened? It can't be a coincidence. So